When Queen Alexandra appointed her ladies-in-waiting, she ensured that they were always women who were elderly and frumpy, unlike any of you. And the reason was she wanted them not to attract the lascivious eyes of her husband, Edward VII. Well, on one occasion, they had a reception in Buckingham Palace for the Shah of Persia, who was visiting. And the ladies-in-waiting were all standing in a group over there, and the Shah pointed to them and said to the king, "Are they your wives?" And the king replied, well, he was about to reply, but before he could get a word in edgeways, the Shah went on to say, you must get them beheaded and get some new ones and nice ones. Fortunately, the king did not take that advice. But the point is that ladies-in-waiting perform a rather peculiar function, a unique function in the monarchy. On the one hand, they're the Queen's personal servants, so they're servants. On the other hand, they're her most intimate companions, the people she can really confide in and trust and get their advice on personal matters. So, as I say, they perform this rather unique function, and it induces suspicion. So, for example, King Henry VIII, with all his wives, was always suspecting that his wives were being influenced by their ladies-in-waiting against him. So he had them spied upon. And if there was the slightest suspicion of disloyalty, she would have them, the lady-in-waiting in question, instantly seized, arrested, and beheaded. Not a beheading in this sermon. And Catherine Howard's ladies-in-waiting suffered particularly. There's big sort of throughput of beheaded ladies-in-waiting for Catherine Howard. Queen Bess, good Queen Elizabeth I, she too was worried about her ladies-in-waiting being wrong in some way, but her concern was adultery. It wasn't that she had any moral worries about adultery, she wasn't interested in that kind of thing. Her concern was that adultery always causes ructions, jealousies, anger, violence and so on, and she wanted her court to be peaceful and calm. So, as I say, she had her ladies-in-waiting spied upon to ensure that they were leading pure lives. Going forward a bit, Charles II regarded his wife's ladies-in-waiting as his personal harem to help himself whenever he fancied. And this became known throughout Europe. So whenever some foreign dignitary came and was wanting a favour from Charles II, the foreign dignitary always brought a nice comely young thing to be yet another lady-in-waiting for the Queen, and hence available to the King. If you go forward a little further to the Hanoverians, all those boring Georges, their worry was being assassinated, and poisoning was one possible way that might happen. And poisoning at mealtime. So what used to happen is that family would be round the dinner table, and the ladies-in-waiting would be standing on the perimeter. And every time a dish was served, one of the ladies-in-waiting would have to come forward and taste it, and then stand back again. If she was still upright after 5 minutes, then they could eat whatever the dish was. The trick, it was hugely long. I mean, the Georges had hugely long menus, endless courses. So it was pretty exhausting being a lady-in-waiting, just standing there waiting. And the trick was not to drink much before you turned up, otherwise it could get desperate. So that's going forward to our own present Queen. I've tried on the internet to find out about her ladies-in-waiting. I can only discover 3. Maybe there are more, but there seem to be 3. They're not frumpy, they're very elegant, but they are old. 2 or 3 of them are in their 90s, like the Queen herself. So she has some extra ladies-in-waiting that actually do the hard work. And their main function is that whenever the Queen goes opening things or sort of engagements of any kind, to make sure that she's properly looked after and they know where the nearest loo is. So that's the ladies-in-waiting function now, the extra ladies-in-waiting, because the real ones are too old for all that. As I say, ladies-in-waiting are a strange mixture of being a servant and companion. Now, when we think of all the royal palaces and so on, it evokes our fascination with the monarchy. Our childhood imaginations were stimulated by stories of King Arthur and the Round Table, King Alfred and the Cakes, Richard Coeur de Lion having to be ransomed for vast sums of gold, of course Henry and his 6 wives, everybody knows about that. We're fascinated by the monarchy. And we might think, all that is just frippery. Why should we as Christians concern ourselves with the innards of the monarchy? We have more serious things to contend with. Well, not at all. The Bible and monarchy are as one. The Bible, a lot of it is about monarchy. So if you remember in the Old Testament, Samuel warned the Hebrew people against having a monarch. They wanted to have a king like the other tribes have kings. But he said, no, as soon as you have a king, he'll turn your menfolk into soldiers, your womenfolk into maidservants. He'll tax you to finance his wars and his palaces. Don't have a king. But if you remember, the Hebrew people were insistent, they needed a king, and God put up with that. He said, okay, if you want a king, I'll help you find one. And you remember, of course, that who was the king that he found in the end? Samuel? Saul, of course, yes, Saul. And so he found Saul, and he was anointed king. And the rest of the Old Testament, an awful lot of it, is about whether kings were good or bad, and how the prophets, the great prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on, responded to those kings. So kings play a central part in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the main metaphor for our relationship with God and God's with us is that of a king. He is our king, and we are his servants. In fact, I was reading a book recently that says the Greek word that we have, that we translate as servant, has actually more the implication of a slave. We are slaves to God. He is the king, we are his slaves. That's what the Bible says. But I think if ladies in waiting had existed back in biblical times, they would have used that metaphor. Because after all, think of our relationship with God. On the one hand, we are his slaves. If God tells us to do something, we jolly well got to go and do it. So we listen for God's guidance and then we follow it. So we are his slaves. But the extraordinary thing is we're not just his slaves. He lifts us up. God wants us to be his friend, his companion. And he has a language that we can talk to him in. We call it prayer. We can communicate with God at any time as a friend. And that is an extraordinary thing when you come to think of it. He's a king and a friend. And the nearest analogy to that is a lady in waiting. We are ladies in waiting to God. I think that's a rather striking analogy. We're ladies in waiting to God. Some of us are gentlemen, but we won't look at that. Now, if you think of how ladies in waiting operated, as I say, they were both companion and servant. Now think of that, the notion of being a servant for a moment. In a big house, a palace or whatever, a royal palace or just a big aristocratic house, we tend to think, having watched Downton Abbey, that all the servants are directly serving the grand family. But that wasn't how it was. A lot of the servants' time was spent serving other servants. So, for example, if you were in charge of the laundry or one of the laundry women, mostly you were washing other servants' clothes, and only sometimes the grand family's clothes. If you were the cooking amongst the cooks, you were making dishes not just for the grand family, but also for other servants. If you were the estate cobbler, you were making shoes for other servants, not so much for the grand family. In other words, servants were serving each other. And that's a rather good analogy. They were like ladies in waiting to each other, if you like. They were friends and companions. And that's rather a good analogy to a church such as this. Yes, we're servants of each other and companions. If you join the Stamford Free Church, you become part of this family of mutual servants. We're ladies in waiting one to another. We both serve each other and we're friends and companions to each other. So we're ladies in waiting to God and to each other. Now there's one occasion in history when ladies in waiting performed an actual role in the course of history. And it happened in 1839, when who was on the throne? Queen Victoria, yes. The young Queen Victoria. And she was a very headstrong and wily lady, and this story illustrates that. In those days, there was a rather odd arrangement, it didn't last very long, whereby Parliament paid for ladies in waiting, and the Prime Minister of the day appointed them. So the monarch at that stage had no decision over who were the ladies in waiting, or the Queen didn't. It was the Prime Minister that appointed them. Well, in 1839, when Lord Melbourne was the Prime Minister, who was Queen Victoria's mentor, he lost his majority in the House of Commons and had to resign as Prime Minister, and the Queen had to ask Robert Peel to become Prime Minister instead. He was leader of the opposition. She loathed Robert Peel. She thought he was a horrible man. And then when Robert Peel said, here's the list of ladies-in-waiting you must have, she was incensed. She didn't want these ladies-in-waiting. She wanted to stick with the ones that she already had, that Lord Melbourne had appointed. But Robert Peel said, I won't be Prime Minister unless you accept my ladies-in-waiting. Extraordinary. There was a constitutional crisis. What then happened was even more extraordinary. The ladies-in-waiting, as one, said, we are happy to serve the Queen for nothing. We don't want payment from Parliament. We're happy to serve her for nothing. And if Robert Peel appoints ladies-in-waiting, well, they'll have to be outside. They can't be in the private apartments. We'll be there. I think Queen Victoria put them up to this. But anyway, the point was they were saying that they were willing to serve for nothing. And Robert Peel had no choice but to stand down. He didn't become Prime Minister at that stage, and Lord Melbourne remained as Prime Minister because of the ladies-in-waiting. So the ladies-in-waiting performed a crucial function of maintaining Lord Melbourne as Prime Minister instead of Robert Peel. And of course that was what Queen Victoria wanted all along, to keep her own ladies-in-waiting. A wily lady she was. Now the point of that story from our present purposes is quite simple. Yes, we are ladies-in-waiting to God, ladies-in-waiting to each other, but it's a privilege, not a job. None of us should ever demand remuneration for what we do. We do it out of love. To be a lady-in-waiting to each other and to God is a privilege and an honour, not a job.